briefly introduce each of them. I'll give you their bios, and then each of them will read for maybe about 8 minutes. And then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor for you to ask them a couple of questions. And then, if you want, you can buy their books out in the lobby, and they'll sign them for you. So, Janet Gilsdorf is the author of 2 novels, Fever and 10 Days, a memoir, Inside Outside, A Physician's Journey with Breast Cancer, a nonfiction book, Continual Raving, about the search for a cure for meningitis, and many personal essays and scientific publications. She is also a physician scientist and emerita professor of pediatrics and epidemiology at the University of Michigan. As a scientist, she pursues the secrets of nature, and in her field of infectious diseases, these secrets are microscopic in size, yet powerful in impact. As a pediatrician, she counsels young patients and their families during both their finest and their worst possible moments. As a teacher, she guides young physicians and scientists through their journeys toward successful lives and careers. And as a literary writer, she integrates the scientific, medical, and personal truths she witnesses and strives to make emotional sense of their meaning. Ann S. Epstein writes novels, stories, memoir, and essays, and has won awards for both fiction and nonfiction, creative nonfiction. She has published 5 novels: On the Shore, Tasia and Gemma, A Brain, a Heart, the Nerve, The Great Stork Derby, and One Person's Loss, with a 6th, The Sister Knot, due out next year. Her shorter work appears in North American Review, Sewanee Review, Prism International, and elsewhere. Anne also has a PhD in developmental psychology and MFA in fiber art, so I heard the fiber art thing out there, good connection, and certification as an end-of-life doula. As an end-of-life doula, she helps those preparing for death write life reviews and ethical wills to reflect on the meaning of their lives and state their values and hopes for those they will leave behind. As a fiction writer, she creates well-researched fiction that blends fact and fiction, and she's gratified when she finishes a manuscript and can no longer remember which is which. And so we'll begin with Janet, who will read from her novel, Fever.
I'll set this up here. I think the publishers did a wonderful job with this cover, so I want you to enjoy it. I'm going to read chapter 9 of Fever. This occurs during a flight, a flight and then arrival back in Michigan from the character's trip to Brazil. Sid is the protagonist of the book. She is a physician scientist who is visiting Brazil with her friend Raven. They're visiting Raven's brother River, who lives in Promoção, Brazil. The other character in here is Isabel, who is one of the children who became ill and then died of this mysterious illness that suddenly popped up in this little tiny village in backwater Brazil. So chapter 9, 1984, Michigan. From the window of the plane, Sid watched the graceful funnel of Point Pelee stretch southward until its tip dipped into Lake Erie. She wondered what would be at the absolute end of that point. A single grain of sand, a glob of seaweed, maybe a beached beer can. A person could stand with a foot on either side of the tip and watch the earth dissolve to nothingness between her legs. Her thoughts circled around the dead children, and her head began to throb as her mind rewound the horrors of Isabel's death. Every step, nothing they did could keep her alive. What more should or could they have done? Against the complex, delightful, and then dreadful, terrific, and then terrible trip to Brazil, she was now almost home, back to the routine of her life and work in the lab. And there was Isabel's blood. She didn't know if any bacteria would grow from it. Very likely not. Without knowing what caused Isabel's death, no one could know how to prevent the mysterious illness or how to treat it. It all seemed so hopeless, and yet the children were dying. She gazed out the plane's window at the fields and towns below and wished she could more clearly remember Brazil as it had been early in the visit. The food and the markets, the birds and the bossa nova, the sing-song of Portuguese conversation day and night. And then those evenings in the company of river and raven, their easygoing humor, the ebb and flow of their conversation, their indelible bond. Sid clutched her large handbag against her chest, as she had during the entire plane ride, felt the scratch of its snakeskin on her arms. The flight attendant leaned toward her. "Ma'am, you have to stow the bag for landing." Before she shoved the bag under the seat in front of her, she ran her fingers yet one more time deep inside, down to the bottom. Still there. She felt the fabric of the T-shirt, the crummy one stained with meat juice from that Brazilian sandwich, and wrapped inside was the firm, round form of the tube of blood. Less than a day ago, that blood had been racing through the dying child's arteries and veins, dripping through her tissues as it fed oxygen to her skin and heart, brain and muscles, and then carried waste away. Now it was merely a biologic fluid, a suspension of cells and plasma in a glass vial, but still precious. "We're about to land," Sid said to Raven. "Remember, no mention of the blood," she whispered. "Not a word. You can pretend you don't know me." After landing, they wound their way through the jet bridge and down the steps to the immigration customs area. Sid led the way to the sign that read, "United States Citizens." When she reached the head of the line, Sid handed her passport to the immigration agent and watched him flip the pages. "Citizenship, United States. Where have you been? Brazil. The purpose of your visit? Vacation. Welcome home." He stamped the stamper against the page and yelled, "Next in line." Sid pulled her suitcase off the turning carousel and headed for the U.S. Customs Station. While they waited, a stubby dog darted from suitcase to briefcase to shopping bag to purse. Sid's palms grew sweaty and her heart pounded. She knew what he was about. She directed her eyes away from him and willed him to ignore her. A burly customs agent grasped the leash while the beagle stopped at each passenger and sniffed. When the dog reached Sid, his nose tracked straight to her bag, and he plunked his butt on the floor. The agent gave the leash a tug, but the dog refused to budge. "Ma'am," the agent said to her, "we'll have to search your purse. Follow me, please. Do you have any fruits, vegetables, meats, drugs, or other illegal imports?" "No, sir." The calm she had so carefully fabricated suddenly evaporated. The agent placed her bag on a stainless steel table, pried it open, glanced into its interior, and slid his hand inside. She held her breath and watched as he pulled, item by item, her belongings from inside. Car keys, wallet, and makeup case, a pen, a tiny flashlight, and a month-old chocolate bar. Then her boarding pass and her paperback book with a folded sheet of Kleenex marking where she'd stopped reading. She felt woozy, leaned against a pillar. He dug deeper and started to pull out the light yellow, meat-stained T-shirt. He jostled the purse and pulled again. The shirt must have stuck on the inside zipper. Sid took a deep breath and held. She wanted to sit down before she fainted. Suddenly, a little boy broke away from his mother and raced toward the beagle. "Mommy, a doggy," he yelled. "Look at the doggy." The beagle pulled back from the table, strained at its leash, and stretched toward the boy. The agent, his right hand still inside Sid's handbag, yanked on the leash in his left hand, yelled a command, and the beagle instantly lay on the floor. When the boy reached the dog, he began patting its head. The child's mother dashed to his side, stooped, set a large Mickey Mouse pillow on the floor, and pulled the boy to her. "Honey, that dog isn't like Riley. We can't play with that doggy." The agent returned to Sid's purse and slowly pulled the yellow T-shirt by one of its sleeves. As it emerged, the dog began to whine, and his neck hairs pointed toward the ceiling. Sid felt her heart banging inside her chest. He'd found it. Finally, after what seemed like a year to Sid, the agent had tugged the shirt free from the purse. He held it up, only the shirt. No tube of blood. Where was it? Not on the floor, not on the table. Had it fallen out of her bag somewhere between the plane and customs? The agent pointed to the stain on the shirt. "Do you know what this is, ma'am?" "Meat juice." She could barely hear her own voice. "From a drippy sandwich I ate a couple days ago in Brazil." The agent waved the stain near the dog's nose. A low, rumbling snarl burbled from deep inside his chest. That must be what he's reacting to. He laid the T-shirt back on the table. "Good sandwich?" he asked. "Yes, sir, a terrific sandwich." The agent gave her another signal to the dog and led him away. Over his shoulder, he said, "Sorry to bother you, ma'am. Please proceed through customs." When they exited the terminal, Sid settled on a cement bench and waited for the parking lot shuttle. She gripped the handbag to her chest. Raven sat beside her. The suspense was eating her hollow. She looked around at the teenager smoking by the curb, at the old lady waving to a passing car. No one suspicious. Was it safe to check? "Where'd the blood go?" Raven whispered. "I don't know." Sid opened her purse and dug down to the bottom. Her hand zigzagged from the left to the right beneath the T-shirt. Her fingers felt the flashlight, the pen, the walnut, the makeup case. Then something firm and smooth as glass, the size of a thin cigar. "It's here," she said, and cradled the tube in her palm, still inside the bag. "Unbelievable," Raven said into a sigh. "You are so damn lucky."
And now Anne will read from One Person's Loss.
Okay, so just to give you the context, it's 1937. Petra and Eric Wedler, German Jewish refugees, are at Brooklyn's Coney Island, their first outing since Petra had a miscarriage 2 months ago. And I'll read part of the opening chapter. "Come and see the incubator babies." Eric's head jerks toward the Barker, strolling down the boardwalk toward them. Born too early, their brains smaller than half an apple, some too weak to suckle at their mother's breast. He wears a sparkling white lab coat and a stethoscope around his neck. "It's just ahead at the next pavilion," he points. "Don't pass the babies by." Petra jumps up. "Let's go." Eric says he doesn't think it's the best thing for her to see right now, but she runs after the Spieler, and he follows. They pass the teaser with its spinning wooden chairs. Eric had tried to coax Petra to ride on it earlier, but she'd refused, claiming the sensation would remind her of morning sickness. Given her reluctance to revisit that memory, she cannot explain to him why she's so eager to look at sickly infants lying in tiny cubicles. Tickets are $0.25. They pass beneath a sign reading, "All the world loves a baby," and into a building decorated like a Hansel and Gretel cottage with a stork overlooking a nest of cherubs. The incubators and ventilating tubes are silver, bright, and cheerful. Petra is enthralled by how sterile and quiet everything is after the grime and body throngs in the rest of the park. The only sound is the quiet hum of the heaters and the occasional soft ringing of an electric bell. This warns us if an incubator overheats. It is Dr. Cooney himself, the force behind the exhibit, demonstrating the apparatus to a gaping crowd. It's modeled after the machines farmers use to hatch chickens. He chuckles. In Berlin, people use the term Kinderbrutenstall, which means child hatchery. I call it a peasant roaster. Women blush, a few men titter. The doctor introduces his wife, Madame Annabelle May Cooney, a nurse likewise trained in the care of premature babies. Together they explain how wet nurses feed the infants, dripping milk into the mouths of the weakest ones, and how the staff prevent infection by using filtered air, isolation, and rigorous hand washing. The starched white overalls of the pediatricians and nurses as they move from one cubicle to the next with their sterile instruments all transfix Petra. It feels sacrilegious to admit the dirty crowd from the park into this spotless temple. Eric, arms crossed, looks disapprovingly at Dr. Cooney, a heavy-stooped man with gray hair and a large mustache, dressed in dark broadcloth and spats under his surgical gown. Rather the dandy, he whispers to Petra. She shushes him, afraid to miss a single word. Our success rate is over 80%, the doctor goes on. Of the 6,000 babies we've treated so far, all of them given up for dead, 4,800 have survived. As the best proof that our methods work, here is our own daughter. Madam brings out Hildegard Cooney, age 30, now one of the nurses on staff. It's a miracle, breathes a large woman at the front of the crowd. The incubator doctor smiles. Not a miracle, just good science. Someday, every hospital will have one of these machines and will save tens of thousands of precious lives every year. Slowly, the other spectators file out. Eric is anxious to leave too. We can afford one more ride, he says. How about shoot the chute? It's not gondolas, but it's on the water. Petra pictures the ride. Painted boats float down a ramp and suddenly drop into a lagoon. She grips her stomach and turns away, eyes locked on the doctor, scrubbing his hands and arms at the sink. Eric stalks out, returning to the sounds and smells of the park. 10 minutes later, Petra leaves, just as the exhibit's lights go off and the lamps lining the boardwalk blink on. Red streaks the sky as she and Eric walk to the train station. Admit it, she says. You don't want children. You were relieved when I miscarried. That's not true. I was heartbroken. Eric hesitates. I'm just no longer sure that this is the right time for us to start a family. Plus, I'm worried about you. Petra sniffs. Eric enumerates the ways he caters to her whims in his efforts to help her get better. I triple wash the vegetables. I pay extra to shop at the indoor market because you insist the street vendors are unclean. How can you say I don't care about you or the child we lost? I can't prove it, but I feel it in my bones. Petra. Eric stops, holds her shoulders, and stares into her eyes. I do want children. I just don't think we're ready yet. That made sense 2 years ago when we got here, but why are you saying it now? Because spoiled only children like you have no idea how much it costs to raise a child. And poor boys like you with a house full of little brothers and sisters do? Frankly, yes. Eric sighs. I'm not being mean, Petra. I just don't see the rush. How can you not, when it's why our family sent us to America? Back home, our parents want grandchildren to justify their sacrifice. We promised. Petra looks at the littered pavement so Eric won't see the desire in her eyes. It is she who most wants a child, but she knows that arguing on behalf of their parents is more likely to sway him. He feels guilty about being the oldest and hence the one chosen to go. They resume walking. Let me think about it, Eric says. Petra gazes at the night sky, reminded of God's ancient promise to Abraham to make his offspring as numerous as the stars in the heavens, a prophecy she and Eric should fulfill now more than ever. Last night I counted $10 in the coin jar, he tells her. If you let me buy apples and onions from Charlie's stand instead of Benno's store, we'll save $1 a week. They reach the station and huddle amid the tired families on the platform. When the Gigi train pulls in, Petra and Eric board and sit, hip to hip, swaying in unison on the short ride home.
So Janet's novel is based on, well, inspired by maybe a real disease outbreak in Brazil. And some of you may know, but I don't know, maybe you don't, that the incubator babies were a real phenomenon that Anne was describing. And so I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about what made you want to take up this event or existence of this incubator baby scenario and write about it and turn it into fiction. And maybe, Janet, you could go first.
Well, there was an outbreak of a very unusual, severe, often fatal disease just among young children in Brazil, in this teeny little area in backwater Brazil in 1984. And it involved a bacterium that I was very familiar with and had worked with my whole professional life. So, although most people don't know about this outbreak, I was very aware of it. And there were a lot of scientific mysteries about this, why this bacteria caused this. It ordinarily should not. Something had changed. This bacteria had mutated in some way to make it deadly. So I thought, I was just very interested in outbreaks. And I thought, well, I can write a novel. I can solve the problem. I can invent the answer to why this bacterium became so deadly. So that was my thinking. I'm fortunate, very fortunate to be in this wonderful writers group who constantly says, you got to tone down the science. You got to tone down the science. Nobody will understand it. And it was too complicated to try to portray it that way. So I just gave up on solving I invented a different mystery to carry through the novel.
So from the introduction, I guess you know that a lot of my work is historical fiction. But I really like to find the quirkier parts of history and build a story or a novel around that. So one morning several years ago on StoryCorps, on Morning Edition, it happened to be a woman who had been an incubator baby talking to her grandnephew about it. And I thought, there's definitely a story there. But for me, the story is, the question is, what is the story? And that's sort of the same as asking, whose point of view is it? Who's the story about? Because my work is very character-driven. So I incubated on it for a while. And, you know, when I did some research and I saw the dates that this incubator exhibit was up for several decades, actually, at Coney Island, you know, I realized that it overlapped with the during and post-World War II years. And I thought, what if the perspective is of a young couple whose family sends them to America, specifically to have children and make sure that their families and their people are perpetuated. And it sort of evolved from there, and there's a conflict, as you can tell from what I've read, between her desire to have a baby right away and his pulling back. And the novel is actually told from both of their perspectives in alternating sections. So you get his perspective too on it. And it takes them through the early 1950s. So we see what happens, you know, during the war. They're trying to figure out what to do about having a family here, meanwhile worrying about their families back in Berlin. So that's that little event in history that actually eventually resulted in hospitals worldwide having incubators and resulted in a novel.
So Janet kind of already touched on the question of how much science to put in her novel. And I know that Anne has, over the many novels, also struggled with how much historical detail to include in her novel. And so I wonder if each of you could speak to that. And Mao, maybe you could go first, Anne.
Okay. So the short answer is less. and on each revision, even less. You know, sometimes, well, like, at least for short stories, sometimes my notes are even longer than the final story. I love doing the research, but I know that people are interested in reading fiction, a novel. I don't write, I'm not a historian, I don't write historical treatises. So, you know, from what I start out with, which is all the history that's of interest to me, I boil it down to what really is integral to the story of the people and the plot. But, you know, I don't want to lose it all because I find it so interesting. So on my website, I started a feature that's called Behind the Story, and that's where I can just put all these interesting tidbits of history that I discover that never make it into the novel or the story. So that keeps me amused, and I hope it keeps readers amused too.
Well, I write what I know, and what I know is medicine and biological sciences. And I love the principles of medicine and biological sciences. So I love to write about them, and I love to craft stories around, you know, whatever medical or scientific thing is motivating me to write whatever I'm writing.
And
So I'm working on a book right now, as they know. They're going, and Hope knows, they're going through this page by page by page, over and over and over again. This one's about genetics and inheritance and mutation. Things everyone knows about now.
I have to say I've learned a lot of science and history from being in a writing group with these guys. And maybe now we could shift to talking about how you became writers, because you both had very busy lives and careers before that. And so what brought you to writing, and how did you learn to do it? I guess we could start with Janet again this time.
Okay, well, this happened well into my adulthood. I was down at Carytown one day, and I ran into this woman that I had known. Her name was Kathy. And her son played hockey with one of my kids, and we used to sit up in the stands and talk about books and stuff. And she said, I hadn't seen her for several years, and she said, say, have you ever thought about writing? And I said, well, it's funny you should ask. I had just gotten back from vacation. We were up in a lake in Minnesota, and I'd been reflecting on my life in medicine and my patients and their families, and thinking, I want to express this some way. I want to find an outlet for expressing what I've learned from these wonderful, wonderful people. And Kathy said, well, I just joined a writing group. Why don't you come with me next time? And so I said, sure. And so the next Sunday, I went with her to the writing group, and I'm still in it. I mean, that was decades ago. And so I knew nothing about creative writing, nothing. You know, I was a scientist. I'd written many grants, many scientific papers, but no creative writing. So I decided, well, if I'm going to do this, I better learn how to do it. And I don't know how long an explanation you want, but that's when I started going to writing workshops every summer. I spent my vacation going to writing workshops so I could learn the craft and the art of creative writing.
Well, it's you know, in the decade or more that I've known I never heard the first part of her origin story.
Oh, you didn't?
So, yeah, so that's wonderful. Okay. As Danielle said in the introduction, I've worked over 40 years before I retired as a developmental psychologist. And a lot of my work was in early childhood education, research, program development. And I wrote for a lot of different audiences, a lot of different, books and articles. But in addition to, academics, researchers, policymakers, I think the audiences that I most liked writing for were teachers and parents, trying to take what I knew from research and translate it into lay people's terms. And in order to do that, I used to include a lot of little vignettes. They might be like composites of things that I'd seen children and teachers doing in the classroom, for example. And I really loved telling these little stories. And about 15 years before I retired, I thought, when I retire, it would be fun to try my hand at writing fiction. And then I said to myself, why wait? Why not see if I like it now, so that when I do retire, I have something else to do. And if I don't like it, I have plenty of time to develop some other interest. Well, I signed up for a creative writing class at Washtenaw Community College, and I loved it. And then I kind of talked my way into a graduate course at Eastern. But that's really all the formal creative writing education that I had, But I started writing short stories, and through one or two other students, I was invited to join an ongoing writers group that I've been in for over 20 years now, and Danielle is also in that group. And it took off from there. And for me, retirement was pretty seamless. On a Friday, I was at my desk at my office writing, and on Monday, I just switched to writing full-time fiction and creative nonfiction in my house. So I didn't look back.
And I feel like I should add there that Ann and I are in 2 writing groups together, and one of them Janet's also in case that was confusing at all. So, thanks, you guys. And I think it's time to open it up for questions from anyone else.
I'm interested, Janet. Are
Yes.
you a pathologist or epidemiologist? Or?
I'm a pediatrician.
Oh.
My specialty is pediatric infectious diseases, but my research had to do with using epidemiologic techniques to understand the molecular biology of these bacteria that I studied. So my lab was actually in the School of Public Health and Epidemiology, so, yeah.
You just mentioned creative nonfiction. What is that?
Memoir might be another way to describe it. So it's nonfiction, but it has the quality of a narrative or stories as opposed to more of a reporting kind of nonfiction.
Sure. Hello. My question is, how has your writing journey matured since joining a writing group, and how has the writing group changed since you've been in it for many years?
You want to answer first, and then I'll...
Well, these and the other members of my writing group have just been so important in helping me refine my work. You know, the rules of our group is honesty. If I'm writing something that's quite mediocre, and they've slapped me or pat me on the back and say, "Oh, good job, good job," that's not useful to me. It's still a mediocre piece of work. I need them to tell me what doesn't work for them, how it can be better, and they have just been invaluable at helping me. It's hard to assess your own work, at least it is for me. And they help me with gentle, kind honesty.
Yeah, so I would certainly second what Janet said. I would also add that I think I learned as much about writing from critiquing other people's work as I do from getting their feedback about mine. And, you know, in both of these groups, the members, we cover a whole range of genres. You know, there are people who write stories or books that they're not anything that I would write, but it really lets me focus on technique. And the most important thing is, how do I help this writer write the manuscript that they want to write, not what I want to write or what I think it should be. So it's very helpful for getting into the heads of other people, just as a writer tries to get in the heads of different audiences. But I can't imagine not being a member of a writers group. And, you know, I've certainly read of very famous writers who've been writing for decades and have books on the bestseller list, and they still belong to writers groups. You always need that extra set of eyes and ears to, as Janice said, to say, this is working, this isn't.
I wonder if either of you or both of you could talk a little bit about the publishing aspect of your experience as distinct from the artistic side of it.
Do you want to start?
Oh, I can start. I'll tell you, it's hard. It is very, very hard. I happen to be the world's most lucky person. So many wonderful things have happened to me in my life that's just dumb luck. The first book I published was a memoir of my experience as a physician and a patient. And that was published by the University of Michigan Press through a colleague of mine who had been working with the press to put together a series of books. I wrote an essay that was published in JAMA, and he said, would you be interested in expanding that essay into a memoir? And I said, sure. So I spent the next year writing this thing. So that was published by the University of Michigan Press. And then I started working on my novel 10 Days, and the publicist from the University of Michigan Press was aware that I was writing this novel. And the University of Michigan Press still, I think, does publish fiction if it's set in Michigan. So I said, well, maybe, you know, I might, when I get this done, I'll send it to the Michigan Press. And their publicist said, oh, I think you could do better than that. So then, months later, I got a call from the publicist who said, you know, I was at this book fair and I met this agent. I was telling her about your novel and she's real interested in it. She wants you to give her a call. That never happens. So I called, Cynthia is her name. I called her and we chatted and she said, that sounds real interesting, send me 50 pages. So I did. And she read the 50 pages and she said, I want to see the rest of this. And so she did, and then we had a contract. That is so just dumb luck. It's very, very difficult to find an agent, and it's very, very difficult for the agent to get many works that they handle published. It's a tough world out there.
So I had no luck and no connections. And at least when it comes to all the short stories I've submitted, and I mean, I've published 2 or 3 dozen by now, but I could wallpaper a McMansion with all the rejection letters that I have. So it's, you just take it in stride and you persist. The woman persisted. So for me, I guess you could say that, you know, the break came there. There's some magazines that are published specifically for writers, like The Writer and one called Poets and Writers. And I believe it was in Poets and Writers, I happened to see a little feature about a press. It was an international one, but they were looking for submissions. They were looking to sort of build up their publishing arm. So I sent off a manuscript, and lo and behold, however many months later, they said, we love it, we'd like to publish it. And all but one of my books I continue to publish with this press, Vine Leaves Press. And the writers there have formed a wonderful, you know, community. I've tried several times to get an agent. I did actually finally land one, and then the pandemic hit, and she sort of gave up on the whole business. So I think a lot of the future for people is not with agents and the big commercial presses, but with small independent presses. And they're always looking, you know, for work. Many of them don't charge any fee to submit work, or they'll have some open periods. So, you know, as I said, persist. And, you know, there are also some websites and services you can sign up for where you'll get emails when various publishers or presses are looking for submissions. You know, and you just hope that something connects. It's very subjective. And, you know, anybody who reads manuscripts will tell you that a rejection is not a reflection on the quality of your work. And it's a boilerplate response, but it's true. You know, there are a lot of great writers out there who just haven't been discovered. So have faith in yourself and keep submitting.
My question is, I think, a little bit of a takeoff from what you were saying about the rejection and how do you keep going. So what I'd like to know is how do you get yourself to write every day, or do you write every day? Like, what is your path to getting it done in light of a really busy schedule or rejection or?
Strong glue and a good chair. And you just glue you don't wait to be inspired. And if you have to, even if you're carving out 10 minutes a day, you just sit down and write. And then the thoughts and inspiration will come, not every day. But you just sort of discipline yourself to do it. I guess like any exercise, whether you want to do it or not, you just do it.
Well, my experience is a little bit different than
Good.
that.
That's more interesting.
I have to wait until, like this book I'm working on now, I just am struggling with it. And I can't just sit there until an idea pops into my head, or it's too much wasted time. But I besides writing, I knit. I love to knit. And there's something about knitting and the rhythm of my hands and watching colors as they weave together that helps my mind go to different places. And I'll be stuck in a place where I'm writing, and I'll just, as I knit, I kind of work it through. And, you know, and it comes to me. Sometimes it'll take a week or so. I'll tell you the other really wonderful thing about a writing group is deadline. I know, February 5th now, I have to present something to this group. And I'll have something to present. By hook or by crook, I will get something to present to them. I work very well with deadlines, and they're really important as a motivator for me.
Thanks. I'm Ann Epstein's daughter, and I'm going to put some words in her mouth about discipline, because, I mean, she's a very disciplined person. She said, okay, you put yourself in the chair and you write, but she also gives herself whatever she needs to get the time and space to sit and write, whether it's, you know, I mean, for various people, it's different things, but whether it's like solitude or socializing, you know, whatever it is that juices you, like, make time for that too. Yeah.
Thanks, yeah.
I have a question. It's not, I hope it's not too tangential. I've been working on a story that's, and I've very little experience with this, but I'm working on a story that's a actual occurrence for me in my teens. And I don't want anybody to know I'm writing about them. And you guys aren't talking about memorials, but I know you're working on a memorial. How do you do that? How are you able to change things or change what you're writing so that, you know, maybe people can recognize themselves in it or maybe not, but you're not being exact about who's there and who hurt who and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't know. You know, my sister is reading Fever now. She lives in Oregon. And when I talked to her the other day, she said, I really like your book. She doesn't always say that. She said, I really like your book, and I can see you all over it. I am not Sid. Sid is a physician scientist because I write about what I know, so I have to make my characters consistent with what I know. But I am not Sid. But you know, when I write, it comes from my brain. And my brain, what's in my brain comes from what I've seen, what I've experienced, or what I've read. And my fiction writing brain just picks and chooses from all that stuff that's in my real brain and puts it together somehow. So I don't know. You know, there's a relatively new genre now called autofiction, in which people write very autobiographical things. They call them fiction, and a lot of times there are parts of it that are fictionalized. That's why I like writing fiction, because I've written both nonfiction and fiction. You don't have to worry about the facts when you write fiction. You could just turn things around a little bit, make it more interesting or more vibrant or more whatever. So and you know, it's fiction. It's fiction.
So I would ask what your intention is in writing it. Is it something you'd like to have published? Are you writing it for yourself? You know, because I think that would make a really big difference in what you do with it. If it's something that you do want to have published, but you're worried, you know, but then you might want to fictionalize it even more. If you're writing it for yourself, I would say write whatever you want that's going to be, whether it's healing or reflective. So I would say ask yourself that question first.
I will also say, I did write, my first book that was published was this memoir of my experience as a patient. And I just wrote and wrote and wrote that thing. I kept a journal during my year of being a patient. So that helped me to get things going. And then after I had the contract all signed and the thing was in the process of publishing, I all of a sudden had a total panic attack. My patients might find out that I wrote this. Because we all know, patients Google their doctors. This would come up on a Google search when they Googled me. And I thought, well, I'm just going to have to live with it because I can't change it now. It's going to be published and it's going to be marketed. And several of my patients' parents did. They were very complimentary. The other thing about the book that I wrote, this memoir that I wrote, in medicine always things happen that everybody wishes didn't happen. And that happened to some of that happened to me as a patient, and I wrote about it. The healthcare system where I was received my care probably wasn't terribly pleased with that. I did not name them, that institution, but wouldn't be too hard to figure out what it is. So I don't know the answer to that. It's a tricky one.
You can write 2 versions.
Yeah, I can write 2 versions, but the main reason I'm writing it actually is I want to start going to writers groups. I want to start, and this is so very new to me, but I like to write, and so it's just now that I have more time on my hands, I like to do more.
Find a group that you trust and that you're willing to open yourself up to. As Janet was saying, our group, and this is true of both of my groups, people are very encouraging and supportive and not at all judgmental.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. You all had such interesting things to say, especially the issue of luck. I think in kind of the Oprah-fied nation we live in, luck is looked at as, just kind of a false, kind of responsibility in the sense that anyway. But I especially liked your presentation as a pediatrician because my mother's a pediatrician. I come from a medical family. I'm not a doctor myself. I used to work in her office. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions. First, do you think writing about, this autofiction or fiction, do you think it made you more compassionate? Because going through the medical system, both as a healthcare worker as well as a patient, I'm finding fewer and fewer doctors who have that kind of compassion to listen to their patients really well. I'll be very honest. Even in my own family, they're certainly not exempt from that accusation. But do you think that, or were you like that before you started writing, and is that what propelled you to write? And the other thing is, how do we find some of these writers groups? Because I'm getting back into writing after a long hiatus, so.
There's a woman over here who needs a writing group too.
So there's a start too. Yes. Let's see, the whole medical thing. There's a cadre of people who believe that physicians who write are better physicians, and I totally reject that. I know so many outstanding physicians that would never write anything like creative writing. That's just not their thing. They do other interesting things. So I don't buy that at all. I don't think my writing has made me a better physician at all. But I do appreciate my patients maybe a little bit more because My patients do not appear, although 10 days does involve a child who was a patient, but it was not any single patient that I ever took care of. But I guess I just view people somewhat differently when I've spent so much time with my characters, molding them and trying to figure out how they're going to react to a situation.
So I think it's 7 o'clock, and the library has been so wonderful sharing this space and the sound system, and this is such a lovely setting. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the library.
Thank you.
And there are some books out in the lobby if you would like to